The cold wind howled across the barren moon, lifting thin layers of dust into the air. Princess Xyra sat on the rough ground, staring at the endless, empty horizon. Her legs, once strong and full of life, were now useless. She could no longer walk, no longer fight. Her own people had abandoned her here, leaving her to survive on scraps in a place where nothing grew. Once, she had been the pride of the Zarethian Empire, strong, beautiful, and powerful. She was the daughter of the High King, a warrior trained from birth, respected across the stars. But that was before the accident, before the explosion in battle that had shattered her spine. Now, no one cared for her, no one even remembered her. In Zarethian culture, strength was everything. Those who could not fight were nothing more than burdens. Even her father had turned his back on her, refusing to look at his broken daughter. She had begged to stay, to serve in any way she could, but they had no use for a crippled warrior. So they had thrown her away like an old weapon, left her on this desolate moon, far from the Empire, far from anyone who would recognize her. She clenched her fists, feeling the rough sand bite into her palms. She wanted to scream, but there was no one to hear her. Then she heard something. A loud crash. The ground shook slightly, and a bright flame appeared in the distance. A ship had fallen from the sky. For a moment, Xyra just stared. She had seen scavenger ships pass by sometimes, but they never landed. Was this one different? With great effort, she dragged herself across the sand, using her arms to pull her body forward. It was slow, painful, and exhausting, but curiosity pushed her forward. When she finally reached the wreckage, she saw smoke rising from a broken ship. The metal hull was cracked, and sparks flew from the damaged engines. The symbol on the side was unfamiliar. This was not a Zarethian ship. Then she saw him. A man. A human. Xyra had heard stories of humans, strange, fragile creatures from a distant world. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy, nor the fastest, nor the most advanced, but they were dangerous in their own way. The Zarethians feared humans not because of their technology or their armies, but because of their willpower. Humans never gave up, no matter the odds. This one was injured. He had a deep cut on his forehead, and he struggled to move as he crawled out of the wreckage. Xyra observed him carefully. He had no armor, no weapons in sight. He did not seem like a warrior. Then suddenly, his eyes locked onto hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The human's face was covered in dirt and sweat, but his eyes were sharp. He did not look at her with pity. He did not look at her with fear. He simply looked, curious. "You're alive," he said, his voice rough. Xyra hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her. "Yes," she finally answered. The human exhaled in relief and sat on the ground, leaning against a piece of broken metal. He wiped the blood from his forehead. "Good. At least I'm not alone on this rock." Xyra frowned. "You should not be here. No one comes to this place. Didn't plan to," he said with a small, tired smile. "Ship crashed. Lucky to still be breathing." Xyra stared at him. This man had just fallen from the sky, survived a crash, and was bleeding, yet he still managed to smile. Humans were strange. She studied him a little longer. His body was smaller than a Zarethian's, but something about him seemed unbreakable. "You are not afraid of me?" she asked. The human raised an eyebrow. "Should I be?" She almost laughed at that. Even though she was crippled, most aliens feared the Zarethian race, but this man did not. Instead of answering, she looked at the wreckage. "Your ship is useless now. You are trapped here." He sighed. "Yeah, figured that out when the engine caught fire." He stretched out a hand. "Name's Daniel, by the way." Xyra hesitated before taking his hand. His grip was firm, steady. He did not recoil from her touch. "Xyra," she said quietly. "Nice to meet you, Xyra," he said. "Mind telling me how we're supposed to survive on this moon?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she did not feel completely alone. Maybe, just maybe, this human could change everything. Thyra sat near the wreckage, her eyes scanning the darkening sky. The sun on this barren moon was fading, and soon the cold would set in. The temperature here dropped dangerously low at night, low enough to freeze flesh. She had survived by finding shelter in a small cave nearby. But now she was not alone. The human, Daniel, was examining the broken remains of his ship. His movements were slow, cautious. The cut on his forehead was still bleeding slightly, and his right arm seemed stiff. He was hurt, but he did not complain. Zara watched him in silence. Humans were strange creatures. He had fallen from the sky, survived a crash, and instead of panicking, he was calmly checking what could be salvaged. "Your ship is useless," she finally said. Daniel let out a breath and leaned against a piece of broken metal. "Yeah, I was hoping to find something, maybe a distress beacon, but everything's fried." He looked at her. "No way to call for help, huh?" She shook her head. "No one comes here. This place is forgotten." Daniel sighed. "Great. Stranded on a dead moon with no food, no water, and no plan. That's just fantastic." Zira narrowed her eyes. "You are human. You are supposed to be resourceful." Daniel gave her a tired smirk. "Oh, you've heard about us." She hesitated. "Zarethians know of humans. They say you are weak, but never stop fighting." Daniel chuckled. "Well, they're not wrong. We're not the strongest, but we don't like giving up." He glanced at her legs. "What about you? You've been here longer than me. How have you survived?" Zyra's jaw tightened. She did not like being reminded of her condition. But she answered anyway. "There is a cave nearby. It provides shelter from the cold." Daniel stood up and dusted off his pants. "Then I say we move before it gets dark." Zyra looked at him, surprised. "You would trust me?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Should I not?" She had no answer for that. No one had trusted her since her injury. No one had even looked at her as an equal. But this human, he did not see her as useless. He spoke to her like she mattered. After a moment, she nodded. "Follow me." The journey to the cave. Dragging herself across the rough ground was difficult, but Zira was used to it. The pain in her arms had become a constant part of her life. She felt Daniel's eyes on her as she moved, but he said nothing. He did not offer to carry her, did not try to help her, as if she were helpless. She appreciated that. Instead, he followed behind, moving carefully over the uneven ground. His breath was heavy, his steps slower than before. He was tired. The crash had taken more out of him than he was admitting. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the cave. It was small, barely large enough for two people, but it was dry and shielded from the wind. Zyra pulled herself inside and turned to look at Daniel. He hesitated at the entrance, glancing at the dark interior. "You coming in, or do humans sleep under the stars?" she asked. Daniel chuckled and stepped inside. He sat down against the rocky wall and let out a long breath. "All right, we've got shelter. That's a start." Zyra nodded. "Tomorrow, we search for water." Daniel gave her a sideways glance. "You already have a plan, huh?" She looked away. "I have been here for many cycles. I know where to find things. But it is difficult." She gestured to her legs. "I cannot travel far." Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his torn jacket and pulled out a small energy bar. "Here," he said, tossing it to her. Zyra caught it instinctively and stared at the small, wrapped object in her hands. "What is this?" she asked. "Food, not much, but it'll help." She hesitated. No one had given her anything in a long time. No one had ever shared with her, not even when she was a princess. Slowly, she unwrapped it and took a small bite. The taste was strange but not unpleasant. More importantly, it was food. She looked at Daniel, studying him carefully. Why? He blinked. Why what? Why help me? I am no use to you. Daniel frowned. Says who? She felt a strange emotion rise in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time. She did not know what it was, but it made her heart beat faster. Daniel stretched his arms and leaned back against the wall. We're both stuck here. If we want to survive, we help each other. That's just common sense. Zyra thought about his words. The Zarethians did not believe in helping the weak. Strength was everything. The strong survived. The weak were left behind. But this human did not think like that. She studied him in the dim light of the cave. His wounds were still fresh. His body was not as strong as a Zarethian's. But his spirit, there was something different about him. Something unbreakable. For the first time in a long while, Zyra felt something other than despair. Hope. She had been left here to die. But maybe, just maybe, she had found a reason to live again. Zyra woke to the sound of movement. Her instincts sharpened, her body tense. In the dim light of the cave, she saw Daniel shifting, trying to get comfortable on the hard ground. His face was pale, his breathing uneven. She frowned. You are injured. Daniel gave a tired smile. Yeah, I noticed. Zyra studied him. The cut on his forehead was swollen, and there were deep bruises on his arms. His body was weaker than his Zarethian's, but he had survived this long. Still, survival would not last if he was in pain and without food. She pulled herself closer. Let me see. Daniel blinked. See what? Your wound. He hesitated, then nodded. Zyra touched his forehead lightly, examining the swollen cut. It was not deep, but without proper care, infection would come. You will not last long if your body weakens. Daniel chuckled. That's comforting. Zyra ignored his sarcasm. She had seen many warriors die not from battle, but from untreated wounds. She would not let that happen to him. There is a plant, she said. It has healing properties. I have used it before. Daniel sat up a little. Where is it? She glanced outside. Beyond the rocky cliffs. It will take time to reach. Daniel stretched his sore arms. Then I'll go get it. Zyra's eyes narrowed. You are weak. Yeah, but I can walk. Zyra exhaled in frustration. Foolish human. Daniel smirked. That's me. She hated to admit it, but he was right. He was their only chance to get supplies. Her legs had long betrayed her, and dragging herself across sharp rocks was not an option. Fine, she said. I will guide you. A dangerous journey. Daniel stepped out of the cave, blinking against the harsh sunlight. The landscape was dry and lifeless, with jagged rocks stretching in every direction. Which way? He asked. Zyra pointed toward the cliffs in the distance, beyond those stones. Daniel sighed. Of course, it couldn't be nearby. He began walking, and Zyra watched from the cave entrance. She hated feeling useless. For years she had fought, commanded armies, and stood tall among warriors. Now she could only sit and wait. She clenched her fists. No, she would not just wait. She dragged herself to the edge of the cave, watching Daniel's progress. He moved carefully, stepping over loose stones and avoiding the sharp ridges. His breathing was heavy, but he did not stop. The human was stubborn. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Zyra grew anxious. The cliffs were home to creatures, silent, deadly beasts that hunted anything that moved. Even she had barely survived one attack. Suddenly, she heard a sound, distant but sharp. A low growl. Her heart clenched. Daniel. A fight for survival. Daniel was near the cliffs when he heard it, a deep guttural sound from behind the rocks. He froze. Slowly, he turned his head. A creature emerged from the shadows. Its body was long and covered in dark, leathery skin. Sharp claws clicked against the stone, and yellow eyes locked onto him. Oh, that's not good. The creature lowered its body, ready to pounce. Daniel reached for a rock, gripping it tightly. "All right, buddy. Let's not do anything crazy." The beast hissed. Then it lunged. Daniel barely dodged, rolling to the side. Sharp claws slashed the air where he had stood moments ago. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. No weapons, no armor. Yeah, this is bad. The creature circled him, its muscles tensed. Daniel knew he had only seconds to react. His eyes darted around. A broken ledge, 10 feet away. If he could lure the creature there. The beast lunged again. Daniel ran. He sprinted toward the ledge, feeling the creature's breath on his back. At the last second, he dropped to the ground, sliding under its claws. The beast leaped forward, too fast to stop. It tumbled over the ledge, its roar echoing as it crashed below. Daniel lay there, panting. Well, that was terrifying. He stood up shakily, wiping sweat from his forehead. All right, plant first, panic later. Hope in the darkness. By the time Daniel returned, the sky was turning orange. Zyra was waiting at the cave entrance, her expression unreadable. When she saw the plant in his hands, relief flickered in her eyes. "You got it," she said. Daniel collapsed onto the ground, holding up the plant. "Yeah, almost got eaten. But hey, no big deal." Zyra took the plant and crushed its leaves. A thick, green liquid dripped from them. "This will help." She gently pressed the liquid against his wound. Daniel winced. "Ow." Zyra ignored him. "You are lucky to be alive." Daniel grinned. "Yeah, that's becoming a habit." Zyra looked at him, her expression softening. For the first time in years, she was not alone. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a reason to fight again. Daniel sat against the cave wall, rubbing his sore arms. The battle with the creature had drained his energy, but at least he was alive. Zyra worked silently, preparing the healing plant he had brought back. The green liquid had already numbed the pain in his forehead, and now she was using the rest to treat her own injuries. Daniel watched as she skillfully applied the remedy to her damaged legs. "You seem to know a lot about medicine," he said. Zyra didn't look at him. "I had to learn." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "For battles." She hesitated, then nodded. "Zarethian warriors fight until their last breath. No one tends to the wounded. If you cannot stand, you are left behind." Daniel frowned. "That's harsh." Zyra met his gaze. "That is survival." He shook his head. "No, that's just cruel." She studied him for a moment before returning to her work. Daniel could tell she wasn't used to kindness. Her people had abandoned her the moment she became weak. But humans were different. After a few minutes, Zyra finally spoke. "You went to great risk to bring this plant." Daniel smirked. "Yeah, I noticed." She tilted her head. "Why?" Daniel shrugged. "Because you needed help." Zyra looked at him, puzzled. "And what do you gain from it?" Daniel leaned back, stretching his arms. "Nothing. Not everything has to be a trade, you know." Zyra fell silent. The idea seemed strange to her. In her world, everything had a price. Power, loyalty, even life itself. But this human had risked himself, for nothing in return. Perhaps humans were more unusual than she thought. A plan for survival. The cave was safe for now, but Daniel knew they couldn't stay forever. Food was running low, and the cold nights were becoming unbearable. "We need to find shelter," he said. "Something better than a cave." Zyra looked outside. "Where?" Daniel scratched his chin. "I saw some ruins on the way back. Could be an old settlement. Maybe there's something useful." Zyra considered his words. Ruins meant abandoned structures, and abandoned structures sometimes held supplies. It was a risk, but they had no better option. She nodded. "Then we move at sunrise. The journey begins." The next morning, Daniel helped Zyra onto his back. She resisted at first, but there was no point arguing. Her legs were too weak to walk. "You're heavier than you look," Daniel joked. Zyra scowled. "And you are weaker than I thought." Daniel chuckled. Guess we're both full of surprises. The journey was slow. The landscape was rough, and carrying Zyra made every step harder. But Daniel didn't complain. He had carried heavy gear before, though never an alien princess. Zyra remained silent for most of the trip, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. She had spent her life leading warriors, making decisions that affected entire fleets. Now she was completely dependent on a human. It was frustrating, but also strangely comforting. They traveled for hours until the ruins came into sight. Broken stone towers rose from the ground like jagged teeth, covered in vines and dust. Daniel grinned. "Told you I saw something." Zyra narrowed her eyes. "We should be cautious. Danger in the ruins." Daniel stepped carefully through the ruins, his boots crunching on dry leaves. Zyra remained alert on his back, ready to warn him of any threats. The place was eerily quiet. Daniel entered what seemed to be an old building, its walls cracked and broken. He set Zyra down carefully against the wall. "Rest here. I'll check inside." Zyra frowned. "Be careful." Daniel smirked. "Worried about me?" She huffed. "You are the only human I have. I cannot afford to lose you yet." Daniel chuckled and moved deeper inside. The place was a mess. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and dust covering everything. But as he searched, something caught his eye. A storage crate. Daniel rushed over and pried it open. Inside, he found old but usable supplies, some metal tools, a flashlight, and food packs. He grabbed as much as he could and hurried back to Zyra. "Look what I found." She examined the supplies. "This will last us a few days." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, and if we clear this place out, we can stay here." For the first time since they met, Zyra almost smiled. "You are not completely useless, human." Daniel grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." A new threat. Just as they began settling in, a sound echoed through the ruins. A deep metallic hum. Zyra's eyes widened. "We are not alone." Daniel turned to the entrance. In the distance, dark shapes moved between the ruins. Figures in heavy armor. Zyra's breath hitched. "Zarethian hunters." Daniel frowned. "Your people?" She shook her head. "No, these are not my soldiers. They are mercenaries, trackers who hunt the weak." Daniel clenched his fists. "And they're looking for you." Zyra nodded. "They will not stop until they have me." Daniel exhaled. "Great, just what we needed." The hunters moved closer, their armor glinting in the sunlight. Daniel grabbed his pack. "We need to leave. Now." Zyra's expression hardened. Running is not an option. They will follow. Daniel glanced at her, then at the supplies. They had fought to survive this long. He wasn't about to let some mercenaries ruin that. He smirked. "Then we make a stand." Zyra blinked. "You are outnumbered." Daniel picked up a metal rod from the crate, spinning it in his hands. "Yeah, but I have something they don't." Zyra raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Daniel grinned. "Human stubbornness." Zyra stared at him, then let out a quiet chuckle. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she thought was lost. Hope. The ruins fell into silence as Daniel and Sarah crouched behind the broken walls. The Zarethian mercenaries moved carefully, their glowing visors scanning the area. Daniel gripped his metal rod tightly. "How many?" he whispered. Zyra peeked through a crack in the wall. "At least 4, maybe more." Daniel sighed. "Great, just 4 against 1. I like those odds." Zyra smirked slightly. "You forgot me." He raised an eyebrow. "No offense, but you can't even walk." She narrowed her eyes. "I can still fight." Daniel grinned. "Good, because we're about to have company." The attack begins. A heavy boot crushed a piece of stone near them. One of the mercenaries had stopped just outside their hiding spot. His armored suit whirred as he scanned the area. "Nothing here," the mercenary growled. Another voice responded, "Keep looking. She's close." Daniel exchanged a glance with Scyra. They had seconds before they were discovered. He took a deep breath and gripped the metal rod tightly. The moment the mercenary stepped forward, Daniel sprang into action. He swung the rod with all his strength, striking the mercenary's visor. The impact sent the alien stumbling backward, his weapon falling from his hands. Scyra reacted instantly. She grabbed the fallen gun and aimed. With precise control, she fired a blast of energy at the second mercenary, forcing him to take cover. The ruins exploded into chaos. Outnumbered but not outmatched, Daniel ducked behind a pillar as laser blasts flew past him. He turned to Scyra. "Can you keep shooting?" She nodded, her hand steady. "I am a princess, but I was also a warrior." Daniel smirked. "Then let's fight like one." He grabbed a piece of broken metal and threw it toward the mercenaries. It clattered loudly, drawing their attention. As they turned, Scyra fired again, hitting one of them in the shoulder. The mercenary roared in pain and collapsed. Daniel seized the chance. He ran forward, tackling the remaining soldier. They crashed into the dirt, rolling across the ruins. The mercenary was stronger, but Daniel was faster. He reached for a sharp rock and slammed it against the mercenary's helmet. The visor cracked, and the alien groaned, dazed from the impact. Scyra crawled forward, her sharp eyes scanning for threats. "More will come," she warned. Daniel stood up, panting. "Then we leave before they do." A desperate escape. The sounds of approaching footsteps filled the ruins. Reinforcements. Daniel helped Scyra onto his back and grabbed the stolen gun. "Hold on tight." Scyra's arms wrapped around his shoulders. "Don't drop me." Daniel chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." He sprinted through the ruins, dodging falling debris and leaping over broken walls. Behind them, the mercenaries shouted and fired wildly, but Daniel didn't stop. Scyra twisted in his grip, aiming the gun at their pursuers. She fired, forcing them to take cover. But as they reached the edge of the ruins, a shadow loomed ahead. Another mercenary, bigger than the others. Daniel skidded to a stop. "You've got to be kidding me." Facing the commander, the large mercenary stepped forward, blocking their path. His armor was heavier, his weapons more advanced. Unlike the others, he did not fire immediately. He tilted his head. "So the fallen princess is still alive." Scyra's grip tightened on Daniel's shoulder. "Commander Zoreth," she muttered. Daniel frowned. "You know this guy." Scyra's voice was filled with anger. "He was once my father's most trusted warrior. Now he works for my enemies." Zoreth chuckled. "Your father's rule is over. You are nothing but a broken relic." Scyra's eyes burned with defiance. "And yet you still fear me." Zoreth's grin faded. "Surrender. You are outmatched." Daniel shifted his stance. "Not happening, buddy." Zoreth sighed. "Foolish human." With shocking speed, the massive warrior lunged forward. Daniel barely had time to react. He pushed Scyra to safety and rolled to the side as Zoreth's fists smashed into the ground, sending dust flying. Scyra fired, but Zoreth's armor absorbed the blast. He grabbed Daniel by the collar and lifted him effortlessly. "You are weak," Zoreth growled. Daniel gritted his teeth. "Yeah. Let's test that." Using all his strength, Daniel drove his knee into Zoreth's stomach. The armor absorbed most of the impact, but the sudden move caught the mercenary off guard. Daniel twisted in his grip and grabbed a small, sharp piece of metal from the ground. Before Zoreth could react, Daniel jammed it into the weak spot near his shoulder joint. The alien roared in pain and dropped him. Scyra seized the moment. She aimed at Zoreth's leg and fired. The shot hit its mark. Zoreth collapsed, clutching his wounded leg. Daniel wasted no time. He grabbed Xyra and ran. A moment of relief. They ran until the sounds of battle faded behind them. Only then did Daniel stop to catch his breath. Xyra exhaled, her expression unreadable. "You fought well." Daniel smirked. "You sound surprised." She hesitated. "I did not expect a human to stand against a Zarethian commander." Daniel shrugged. "You haven't met enough humans." Then, for a moment, they sat in silence, the tension slowly fading. Then Cyrus spoke again. "We need to leave this planet." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I figured." She met his eyes. "And I need your help to do it." Daniel grinned. "Well, Princess, looks like you're stuck with me." For the first time, Xyra smiled. But deep inside, she knew the real battle had only just begun. The cold wind howled through the ruins as Daniel and Sarah caught their breath. The battle had left them exhausted, but they couldn't stop now. Daniel looked back toward the ruins. "They'll come after us again." Xyra nodded, adjusting her grip on the stolen weapon. "We need to keep moving." Daniel frowned. "Where to?" She pointed toward the distant mountains. "There is an old outpost there. If we can reach it, we might find a way off this planet." Daniel sighed. "Great. Just a simple walk through alien wilderness while being hunted." Xyra smirked slightly. "You are learning what it means to be in my world." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah. Well, your world is kinda terrible." She didn't argue. Through the wildlands, the terrain was rough, filled with jagged rocks and twisted alien plants. Strange creatures scurried in the darkness, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Daniel carried Xyra on his back, carefully navigating the uneven ground. "You don't have to carry me," she muttered. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Oh yeah, and how exactly are you going to walk through this mess?" She sighed, but didn't argue further. After an hour of walking, Daniel finally set her down near a small cave. "We'll rest here for a bit." Xyra hesitated, scanning the area. "I don't like stopping." Daniel sat beside her. "You don't like a lot of things." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't know what's chasing us." Daniel leaned back against the cave wall. "Mercenaries, bounty hunters, assassins. I think I got the idea." Xyra shook her head. "No, Zorath will not stop. He sees me as unfinished business." Daniel glanced at her. "Then we'll finish it first." She blinked. "You think you can fight him again?" Daniel smirked. "I don't think. I know." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. The storm approaches. Dark clouds gathered above. And soon, heavy rain began to fall. The alien storm was unlike anything Daniel had seen before. Thick, almost glowing raindrops that sizzled when they hit the rocks. Xyra watched the storm with a tense expression. "We need to move faster." Daniel frowned. "Why?" She pointed toward the sky. "That's not just rain. The storm is full of electrical energy. If we stay too long, it could fry us." Daniel cursed under his breath. "Okay, no pressure." He helped her onto his back again, and they pushed forward through the rain. Each step was harder than the last, but Daniel refused to stop. Then, in the distance, he saw something. Lights. "There!" he shouted over the wind. "That must be the outpost." Xyra's eyes widened. "You actually found it." Daniel grinned. "Told you. Humans are stubborn." The last obstacle. They were close, but then a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the storm. Daniel froze. "Tell me that was your stomach." Xyra shook her head. That was something else. From the shadows, a massive creature emerged. It was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. A towering beast with razor-sharp claws and glowing red eyes. Xyra's grip tightened. A night stalker. Daniel sighed. Of course it has a scary name. The beast snarled and lunged. Daniel barely dodged as it swiped at him. its claws ripping through the mud where he had stood a second ago. "Any bright ideas?" Daniel shouted. Zyra raised the stolen weapon. "Distract it. I'll take the shot." Daniel groaned. "Why am I always the bait?" But he didn't hesitate. He grabbed a rock and threw it at the creature's head. "Hey, ugly. Over here." The Night Stalker turned toward him, its eyes flashing with rage. It charged. Daniel rolled to the side just as Tyra fired. The blast struck the beast in the chest, making it roar in pain. But it wasn't enough. The creature turned its attention toward Tyra now, its eyes burning with fury. Daniel saw its muscles tense. "Oh no, you don't." He ran forward and grabbed a broken metal pipe from the ground. With all his strength, he rammed it into the beast's side. The creature howled and staggered. Zyra didn't waste the chance. She fired again, this time, a direct hit to its head. The Night Stalker collapsed with a final growl. Daniel fell onto his back, panting. That was the worst thing ever. Zyra breathed heavily. "You were not terrible." Daniel laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Reaching the outpost. They finally reached the outpost. The doors were rusted, and the place looked abandoned, but it was still standing. Daniel pried the doors open and stepped inside. The place was dark, filled with old equipment and dust. Zyra examined a console. "If we can activate this, we might be able to send a distress signal." Daniel leaned against the wall. "Great. Do that while I just pass out for a second." She smirked. "Weak human." He grinned. "Broken princess." For a moment, they just sat there, exhausted but relieved. But deep inside, they both knew this wasn't over. Zoreth was still out there, and the final battle was coming. The old outpost flickered with weak light as Daniel and Zyra worked to activate the control panel. Outside, the storm raged on, and every rumble of thunder felt like a warning. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. How much longer? Zyra's fingers moved quickly over the alien console. Almost there. Just need to bypass the security lock. Daniel sighed. "Great, because I think we have company." Through the cracked windows, dark figures appeared in the storm, heavily armed warriors, their armor reflecting the flashes of lightning. At their center stood Zoreth, his glowing red eyes locked onto the outpost. Zyra froze. "He found us." Daniel clenched his fists. "Let him come." The final stand. Zoreth's voice boomed through a speaker. "Princess Zyra, there is nowhere left to run. Surrender now, and I may be merciful." Zyra took a deep breath. "Mercy? You took everything from me." Zoreth laughed. "And yet you still breathe. That was my mistake." Daniel grabbed a weapon from the storage unit. "We're not giving up." Zyra hesitated, then nodded. "No, we fight." The doors exploded inward as Zoreth's men stormed in. Daniel fired first, hitting the closest warrior. Zyra ducked behind cover and returned fire. The room filled with flashes of energy blasts and the sound of shattering glass. But then Zoreth stepped forward, his massive frame unfazed by the chaos. With a flick of his hand, he sent out a shockwave that sent Daniel crashing into the wall. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand. Zoreth smirked. "You are persistent, human, but you are nothing." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Yeah. Then why are you afraid of us?" Zoreth's expression darkened. "Afraid." Daniel took a step forward. "You tried to erase Zyra because she didn't fit your perfect vision. You thought she was broken. But guess what? She's still here." Zyra slowly stood beside him. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Zoreth growled. "Then you will die together." A risky move. Before Zoreth could strike, Zyra activated the control panel. A loud alarm echoed through the outpost. Zoreth's eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" Zyra smirked. "I sent a distress signal. My father's loyal fleet will arrive soon." Zoreth's face twisted with fury. Lies. Daniel saw his chance. He grabbed a metal pipe and swung it with all his strength, striking Zoreth in the side of the head. The warlord staggered, but he wasn't down yet. Kyra, now, Daniel shouted. Xyra fired her weapon at the ceiling, causing the unstable structure to collapse between them and Zoreth. Dust filled the air. Xyra grabbed Daniel's hand. Come on. We need to get to the landing pad. They ran through the outpost, dodging falling debris. Behind them, Zoreth roared in frustration. Escape and revenge. Outside, the storm was clearing, and in the distance, bright lights appeared in the sky. Xyra smiled. The fleet is here. A transport ship landed nearby, and soldiers rushed out, weapons drawn. Zoreth emerged from the ruins, his body covered in dust and fury. But when he saw the fleet, his expression changed. No, he whispered. Xyra stepped forward, her confidence returning. Your rule ends here, Zoreth. The soldiers surrounded him, weapons ready. He knew he was beaten. Daniel watched as they took him into custody. Well, that was satisfying. Xyra turned to him. It's over. Daniel smirked. Told you we'd make it. A new beginning. Back on the royal ship, Xyra faced her father, the king. He looked at her, emotion in his eyes. My daughter, I thought I lost you. Xyra held her head high. I'm still here, father. The king nodded. And I see now that you were never weak. Xyra turned to Daniel. I couldn't have done it without him. The king studied Daniel. A human. Daniel shrugged. Yeah, we're full of surprises. The king smiled slightly. Indeed. The final choice. Later, as they stood on the balcony of the ship, Kyra looked at the stars. Daniel stood beside her. So, what happens now? Xyra sighed. My people need me. I have to rebuild. Daniel nodded. I get that. She looked at him. But you don't have to leave. Daniel blinked. Wait. What? She smiled. Stay. Be part of this new future. Daniel thought for a moment, then grinned. You know what? Why not? Xyra held out her hand. Daniel took it. The fallen princess had risen again. And this time, she wasn't alone. The end.